We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Dalet Amud Aleph Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 104a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara asked, what happens if a seller sells a base core of land to a buyer, but he doesn't say that it's mida bechevel, he doesn't say measured by a rope, meaning exact, but he also doesn't say hein chaser, hein yeser, he doesn't say it might be a little less, it might be a little more. What is the halacha in that situation? And the Gemara is in the middle of giving an answer from the Mishnah itself. The Mishnah itself in the beginning says that if he says mida bechevel, if he says measured by a rope exact, so then pachas kolshu, then if it's even a little less yinacha, then he has to deduct from the price that the buyer will pay. And yeser kolshu, let's say he gives a little more land, yachzer, that has to be returned. And so we can infer from the Mishnah hastama, let's say he didn't say mida bechevel. Let's say he just said, I'm selling you a base core of land. So then kain chaser, hein yeser dummy, that's the same thing as saying it might be a little less, it might be a little more. It's only if you say exact that you're held to that standard. But the Gemara continues a masefa, but let's look at the end of the same Mishnah, of our Mishnah. V'mamar lo hein chaser, hein yeser, but if he says it might be a little less, it might be a little more, so then afilu piches rova l'sa, even if it's less by a quarter, means to say a quarter of a kav per sa, a hosir rova l'sa, let's say it's more by a quarter of a kav per sa, higio, so then we still say that the sale goes through. So that sounds like it has to be that you say hein chaser, hein yeser. You have to say it might be a little less, it might be a little more, otherwise it has to be exact. Hastama, if he just sells it stama, he says a base core without adding anything. Kamida bechevel dummy, that sounds like it's as if he said it's going to be measured by a rope, it has to be exact. And so the Gemara says, rather you can't see anything from the Mishnah because you have opposite inferences depending on which line in the Mishnah that you focus on. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here a proof from the following Braisa, base core afar ani mocherlach. If he says, I'm selling you a base core of land, kibase core afar ani mocherlach, or I'm selling you about a base core of land, hein chaser, hein yeser ani mocherlach, I'm selling you might be a little less, it might be a little more. In all three of these cases, afilu piches rova l'sa, even if it's less by a quarter of a kav per sa, a hoser rova l'sa, let's say it's a little more by a quarter of a kav per sa, higio, that's going to go through, meaning to say it's a good sale. And the first case of this brisa was a case of stama. So alma we see, stama nami kain chaser and yeser dami, that if he just says I'm selling you a base core, and he says that's stam, that's the same thing as saying hein chaser and yeser. The Gemara says not necessarily a proof from this brisa. Hasam perushe kamefarish, over there in the brisa, could be the brisa just elaborating and explaining what it means. Meaning to say, Ezahu base core, shehi ki base core. When do we say that if you sell a base core, it's as if you're selling about a base core? Kigon, do amarle, for example, if the seller says to the buyer, hein chaser, hein yeser, if he says hein chaser, hein yeser, it means to say that he's selling about a base core. But the Gemara says, Ma'askefla Rav Ashi asks on this, if so, ani mocherlach, lamali, why does it need to say ani mocherlach every single time? The way that it's phrased over here, base core afar ani mocherlach, ki base core afar ani mocherlach, hein chaser, hein yeser, ani mocherlach, sounds like three separate cases. Elalav, but rather is it not? Shmami, no, we see from this, stamanami, hein chaser, hein yeser, dummy, that if he sells it stam, if he just says a base core, I'm selling you, that is the same as saying hein chaser, hein yeser. And the Gemara says, Shmami, no, the Gemara says, indeed, we do see that that is the case. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Mahu machzer lo, what does he return to him? Meaning, what does the buyer return to the seller in a situation where the buyer got too much land? Most, he returns money. And the Mishnah went on to say that's because we are strengthening the position of the seller. Because sometimes the seller is not going to want the land back because it's too little land to be useful. And so therefore, if the seller wants the money back instead, so the buyer has to give money back to the seller. And the Gemara says, Liyafos kocho shel mocher amrinon, liyafos kocho shel lokeach lo amrinon. Are we only saying that we're trying to increase the strength of the seller and not to increase the strength of the buyer? What if it's the buyer who wants to return money and not land? So maybe we should say there also that even if the seller wants the land, but the buyer should have the option to give back money. And the Gemara says, V'atanya, but we learned in a brisa exactly that idea, that it seems like the buyer does have the prerogative to give back money, even if the seller wants the land back. It says in the brisa, Piches shivas kabenu mechsel lekor, let's say it's less by 7.5 kav per core, a hoser shivas kabenu mechsel lekor, let's say it's more by 7.5 kav per core. So then higio, so then we say the sale goes through. That's the amount that we allow the sale to continue. But yoser mikan, but if it's more than that, so kofinas hamocher limchor v'yasalokeach likach, we force the seller to sell and we force the buyer to buy. It sounds like we're forcing on both sides, meaning to say, if the buyer would say that I would like to give money and I don't want to give land, even in a situation where the seller says I want the land, it sounds like we're saying that we would force. We would say no. The buyer wants to give back money, he's allowed to give back money. And And the Gemara says, no, that's not what the Brisa means at all. Hasam over there could go to have a Yakira Meikara Vizol Hashta. The case is that the land was actually more expensive originally, but right now when the seller is trying to get back, let's say the seller gave too much land, he's trying to get back the money, so now the land is worth less. So the Amrina Lei, so we say to him, Iara Yahavdele Havli Kazula Dehashta. He says, if you were giving me land, so then you would have given it to me like the lower price. Meaning to say that the buyer is allowed to tell the seller, if you were selling me this small piece of land right now, it would have been at the cheaper rate, and therefore if I'm giving you money, I can give you the lower amount, I can give you according to the price that's lower right now. But the Gemara continues, Vatanya, but didn't we learn in a Brisa, Kishu no sein lo kashar shalakach mimenu? It says the exact opposite. When he's giving him money, he goes according to the price at the time of the purchase. And so therefore that's exactly the opposite. The Gemara says, no, Hasam over there could go into have a zula meikar of yikra lahashta. That's just the opposite case. There we're talking about a situation where it was actually land was worth less originally at the time of the sale, now it's worth more. Again, in that situation as well, the buyer is allowed to say that I'm going to give you money, but it's going to go according to the value of the land at the cheaper point in time. And the Rashbam explains, the Brisa said, Kishu no sein lo mocher lokech, when the seller gives it to the buyer, again, it goes by the original price, is what the second Brisa explained, and the Gemara then said, could go into have a zula meikar. That's talking about in the reverse situation, when the land was actually cheaper originally, because then the buyer can say to the seller, lo ba'inan liknos karka biyoker, I don't want to pay the higher rate, the rate right now, to make because originally when I bought the land, if not for the fact that I found it at a cheaper rate, lo hayisi locha, I never would have bought it. So now you want to get money because you gave me extra land, I'm going to buy that extra land at the cheaper rate. And the point over here is, any time that the buyer has a good claim, lo yifu chachamim kocho democher, the chachamim did not say that the seller gets the upper hand in that situation. In other words, if the buyer has any claim why he should pay the cheaper rate in terms of reimbursing the seller, giving the seller money, he can always go by the cheaper rate. Hilkach, therefore, imrotza mocher lichfoso yiten lo keshas shalokach. If the seller does want to force him, meaning the seller wants to say, I want you to give me money, I don't want you to give me the land back, but still it has to go by the cheaper rate, in this case by the rate at the time of buying the land originally, dahainu bezol, that's always the cheaper one. Dahashta les leitaina lelokeach v'yikna bal karchu. In that situation, if you're going to go by the cheaper rate, so now the buyer has no claim, and therefore the seller can compel the buyer and say, I would like money instead of land. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Shem Shire besada base teskabin v'chulu. Let's say the amount that the seller gave the buyer extra was 9 kav. So if it was 9 kav of land already, that's considered a useful piece of land. There the seller cannot demand money instead of the land. The buyer can give that excess land back. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna says, Teskabin Shamra, when we say that there's excess land of 9 kav, Va'afilu bebika gedola, that's even in a situation where the original sale was a very large amount of land, meaning it was not that the Teskabin represented beyond a rova lasa, that was the proportion given in the Mishnah in terms of what's considered excess that gets returned to the seller. No, once it accumulates to 9 kav, even in terms of percentage, it's much less. It's a very small amount of extra land, but 9 kav is significant, and that is always going to be returned. That's what Rav Huna says. But Rav Nachman says, no, it means to say, no sein shivas kabanu mechsa l'chol kor v'kor. You're still going by the same proportion of 7.5 kav per kor. That's the same thing as the rova lasa that we mentioned. When we say 9 kav, it just means to say that if the percentage is the amount that normally gets returned, and it happens to be 9 kav, so then the buyer returns the land to the seller cannot compel him to give him money instead, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Dalid Amud Beis.